this session will be recorded, and I expect it to be posted to Canvas in case you need to hear it or see it on Wednesday at some point. It won't happen tomorrow. It'll probably happen on Wednesday. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a bit of a quick little question for everybody here, and I thought this might be helpful just to kind of get a feel for what your own experiences have been. I'm going to launch this poll here and see what you folks have to say about it. The poll is open right now, and so if folks can respond to this poll, I'd appreciate that. So it's interesting. Our responses are 50% of you have indeed had to discipline an employee. 50% have not. And this session directly focuses on that. The first time I ever had to deal with this, I was about, I'm guessing 27 or 28 years old. And I had been for a few years supervising people in a work rehabilitation program. I was a rehabilitation counselor at the time in my life, and I was working with adults with cognitive and psychiatric disabilities. And things had gone fine, and we hired a guy as part of the program. He wasn't one of the professional members of the staff, but he was one of the members of our staff and facilities operations. And for about 6 to 9 months or so, things seemed to go really well with him. And then things just seemed to kind of go downhill. I don't know what happened. And I noticed that he wasn't getting along with people, and people were not getting along with him either. And so that was a real source of frustration. And it was the first time I ever had to have some difficult conversations with people. And I want to be clear that I was totally and utterly unprepared about how to do that, and so that was definitely a bit of a challenge for me. By the way, if you've not yet muted yourself, we can hear the background noise. So if you can mute yourself, that would be great. Again, if you need to talk to me, just unmute yourself. Okay. So I'll give you a second to mute yourself. Ultimately, it did reach the point where, despite my best efforts and despite some people who were very senior coaching me about how to handle this situation, that person had to be fired. And that was a difficult situation, to say the least. And that leads me to put up another poll here. And so let me close the first poll, and let me put up a second poll here. And I'm going to launch that poll. Okay. And again, if you can respond to this poll. Okay. So here we've got a bit of a different split. On this poll, 18% of you, 18% said that you have had to fire somebody. 82% said that you've not yet had to do that. And that doesn't surprise me in particular, because a number of you have not yet kind of moved into that phase of your career where you're managing folks. But it is worth saying that almost all of you will face this dilemma at some point. It is not a dilemma that you generally get taught how to handle in school. Many graduate programs don't address it at all, and that's why I wanted to address it in this module. So there are several components to this module that are outside of this particular session. The first of those is a short video on giving negative and constructive feedback. So I certainly believe it would be really important for you to watch that video and try to get those principles, because those principles, I think, will genuinely help you as you begin to work on this week's assignment. Um, Another thing that is there is kind of a brief introduction to managing poor performance. And that includes just a bit of the history of things like progressive discipline. And it also includes a brief discussion of what's referred to as employment at will, which is a really important concept to understand. So again, I hope you'll be watching that as well. That'll be important. And the final short video is a video on firing somebody and how those discussions go. That's not my intent tonight, but discussions about firing people, when we actually have that discussion, are generally very brief in organizations. And I mean, literally very brief. I've witnessed a lot of these discussions as an employee relations and HR person in my corporate life. And so I was kind of the third party witness. And many of these conversations last 5 to 10 minutes. And the person knows that they've been fired within the first 60 seconds. These things are often very, very quick and very different than what we're going to be talking about tonight. So those are 3 videos. They're in the module. I encourage you to look at them. And what I want to talk about is how to make some of these difficult conversations about managing poor performance somewhat easier. So jump in with questions, or send me a chat message, or just mute yourself and unmute yourself and jump in with a question anytime you'd like. Okay. All right. Let me get started here. You should all at this point, by the way, be able to see the screen, my slides. If you can't see the slides, please text me or message me and let me know. By clicking and typing something in the chat box. A lot of the ideas I'm going to talk about tonight come from a book that's quite old. Its original edition dates back 20 years, although there are more recent editions. The author of it is a guy named Dick Grody. Dick Grody's a guy who's written a number of books targeted at managers, not academic style books, but books targeted at managers, generally around issues around managing performance, whether it be good or bad. And he wrote actually what I thought was a terrific book that I recommend to you, that you can still pick up, called Discipline Without Punishment. And a number of these ideas will come from his book. So let's start off with one of the first things we ought to be thinking about when we're managing poor performance. And that's that we often have a tendency to immediately jump to the conclusion that poor performance must be due to something wrong with the individual. And especially we tend to just blame it on a lack of effort. But often it's not that simple. Sometimes performance problems arise from a lack of resources. The person simply doesn't have the tools or the time or the information needed to do a good job. Or they simply don't know the expectations. We think they do, but it turns out they don't. And we'll talk about that and how we're going to grapple with that issue. Sometimes they lack the knowledge or skill to do it. That is, if they were trying their hardest, they still couldn't do it well. And that's an important insight to have, because if that's the case, we'd have very different kinds of conversations with somebody, right? We'd be dealing with training or coaching. We wouldn't be dealing with some of the kinds of conversations we're going to be talking about this evening. But sometimes, really, the person does have the resources. The expectations are clear. They do have the knowledge. They do have the skill. But they're still not doing what we need them to do. They're not executing. Obviously, depending on what we think the cause of the performance problem is, we'd approach the issue very differently. So that's one thing we always want to be keeping in mind, and let's not jump to the assumption that the problem is always a failure to execute. So we're going to start with kind of a general guide to coaching discussions that are focused on solving these kinds of performance problems. And you'll see in this week's case, we're going to give you a case of somebody who's a market research professional, and there have been several problems with this person's work in recent weeks and months. It's clearly reached a point where you, as the person's boss, needs to sit down with this person and have a conversation. What might likely be a difficult conversation. And we're going to ask you to think through, using these guidelines, how you would approach that conversation, and to literally write about what you would do before you met with the person, how the meeting would go, what would you be talking about, what would your agenda be for the actual conversation, and what would you be doing after the fact. So here's the general guide. First, there are a variety of categories of performance problems. Some performance problems are as straightforward as attendance issues. And I've seen this certainly in non-management employee groups. As I mentioned, many years ago, I worked at a casino in Atlantic City in the early days of Atlantic City. And they had about, at peak, they would usually have about 600 or 650 dealers and another 200 or so floor persons and pit bosses. And with dealers in particular, it was amazing how often the problem was just an attendance problem, which is pretty straightforward to have a discussion about. Of course, many of the problems are really performance problems. Things just aren't happening that ought to happen, and they're not being done well, and they're not living up to expectations. And those things are more likely to occur with a professional kind of workforce, but they could occur at any level. And some are what I would refer to as conduct problems. These are just simple violations of basic civility. I've seen these kinds of things only a couple times, but they're real. As a simple example, I once saw two people get into an argument in a cafeteria, and I saw one of the people across the room from me pick up his chair and whip it through the air at the other person. That's what I'd call a conduct problem. There are other examples of conduct problems, simple violations of rules. You know, the company has a policy that says you're not allowed to smoke a cigarette on the grounds, not even just in the building. You're not allowed to smoke on the grounds at all. And yet we see somebody outside smoking on the grounds. That's a conduct problem. And it's often helpful to kind of try to focus on one problem or one category of problem at a time. That, of course, often doesn't happen. And the reason why it doesn't happen is probably with you the same reason as it was with me. You know, something isn't going well. None of us like to have difficult conversations, so we delay it. Or we say to ourselves, you know, that only happened once, it probably won't happen again. You know, and then, you know, a week later it happens again. But at that point, we're really busy and we're dealing with some other problems, and we think, well, listen, I'll have a conversation about this as soon as I can get these other things done. But suddenly it's a week after that, and it just doesn't seem timely to have a conversation. And then it happens again 2 weeks later, and now suddenly you've got 3 different incidents that have occurred, and you haven't even had a conversation with the person. So although the ideal advice, of course, is to talk about each one of these as they occur, many of us, because of our reluctance to have difficult conversations, delay. And so when we do have a conversation about issues, we have multiple issues, not one issue. All right, here's the first big thing. This is the principle I want you to be thinking about when you tackle the problem for our assignment this week. Before you meet with the person, it's really useful to do 2 things. Write down exactly what happened. Don't make any inferences. Don't be saying to yourself, "Oh, this person was irresponsible." That's a trait. We don't want to say that. It's not helpful to say that. Whether it's true or not is not relevant. What you want to write down is the actual behavior that you observed. You know, and be as specific and concrete as you can. With this report, it had these problems: A, B, C, and D. So write those down. Write down what happened. Or during the meeting, Karen said JKL. You know, well, write down exactly what Karen said. And then right next to that, write down what you expected. What would be your expectations about what somebody should be doing? How this situation should have been handled? So you have side by side a written note to yourself that says, here's what actually happened. Describing the behavior, not anything about the individual's personality. And a written note to yourself about what your expectations are, what the company's expectations are. So that's a great thing to do, because as you'll see, it'll shape and provide guidance for the entire conversation you're going to have. So these are incredibly simple examples. We can deal with some more complicated ones in a moment, but take the one on the bottom. Your expectation might be that all employees are to respond to customer questions courteously, but you actually heard Karen saying to a customer, "That's a pretty ridiculous question, isn't it?" Now you might say, well, nobody would ever say that, but that example actually comes from some consulting I was doing at a bank many years ago, where a branch manager literally heard one of her tellers say that to a customer. So those are very simple examples of what's expected and what's the actual performance. Of course, in more professional settings, things get more complicated. This report was expected to be done this way, but this was missing from it, or there wasn't sufficient detail here, or I expected an appendix that had this in it, or the customer of the report wasn't happy because it didn't include X, Y, and Z, which they had asked to be addressed in the report, whatever. So the expected performance and the actual performance are often a bit more complex, but nonetheless, you can write those down. It's a pretty straightforward process. The next thing you want to do, notice that all of this is happening before the meeting. And in the framework for the homework assignment for this week, I am asking you, what would you do before you met with this person? So another thing to do before you meet with the person is think about, what's the good business reason why this problem needs to be solved? Or stated simply, why does it matter? Think to yourself, what would happen if the employee said to you, I don't see why it's a problem? What difference does it make? Well, they might or might not say that. I've actually had an employee say that to me one time. But it's good for you to imagine that they do say it, and for you to be prepared with a good answer. Here's why it matters. Here's how it affects me. Here's how it affects your coworkers. Here's how it affects customers. Here's how it affects operations. Here's how it affects the business. Whatever it is, try to be very concrete about a business reason why this needs to be solved. Because if there's no business reason why it needs to be solved, why would you be having this conversation? Write that down. It'll give you a bunch of confidence, I think. And again, you'll be able to use that. Here's another thing to think about before you meet with the person. Think to yourself, what would happen if this problem doesn't go away? What would happen if the person ignores the conversation you're about to have and these problems continue? Now, that could be a lot of different things. I mean, it could be in some instances maybe just a need to more closely supervise the person. It could be that they get assigned less desirable tasks. It could be that it'll actually affect their salary increase at the end of the year and they'll get a lower salary increase. It could be that it's serious enough that you think this is going to move you into a discipline process. So I think it's really helpful just to have that in mind. Again, if the person says something to you like, listen, I'll try, but I can't guarantee I'll change. Yet another thing I've had people say to me, it is useful to be able to say, I understand what you're saying. I just want you to understand that there are consequences if this continues. Here's what the consequences might be. And so you need to think through, what might they be in this circumstance? Sometimes it's helpful to talk to other managers who've experienced similar situations to know what consequences happened, because that way there's some consistency. And sometimes it's helpful if you have a really good HR liaison to talk to somebody in HR who knows the way the company typically handles these problems. And the last thing, before you even meet with the person, is you ought to come up with some ideas about what the person could do differently. I'm not saying it's your problem to solve, but it is helpful, I think, for you to be able to offer some useful suggestions. You're going to engage the person, hopefully, in a two-way conversation, so you're going to be asking for their suggestions, but you should have some suggestions too. Sir, so what are some ideas that you have for moving forward? So I would write down everything from steps 1 through 5 that I just described. Everything. And at that point, and only at that point, do I think you're ready to meet with the person. Okay. Next up, questions that people often have. Where should we meet? Well, a lot of people advise that it's probably not good to meet in the employee's workspace. Some people think it's a good idea to meet in the manager's office. I personally don't like that idea because I don't want my office to become a place that has a negative connotation for the individual. So my recommendation, and the recommendation of a lot of other people, is wherever possible, try to meet in a neutral third space. It could be an empty conference room where there's some privacy, but the key thing, of course, and most important thing, is privacy. When should you meet? Well, a couple of pieces of advice. One is, as I said, you need to get the facts straight. Know what happened. If that means you got to ask a few questions of some other people beforehand to make sure you get the facts straight, do that. Another really key thing is to make sure you're not meeting when you're angry or you're upset. That'll come through. Even if it doesn't come through in your words, it'll come through in your tone of voice and your body language. And tone of voice and body language are really important. If it's a disciplinary action, you might need to get an approval for that from HR or from senior management. How should you do it? Well, one thing is, whenever possible, avoid doing an electronic communication. Don't use email. Everybody will tell you that. It might seem like it's easier for you because you don't have to face the person, but it's bad because it's very easy to misinterpret the tone and intent of an email message or any electronic communication. It really is. So you really want to avoid that. Yeah? So generally, in whatever space you have, think about how serious the problem is. If it's not a big problem, if it's just kind of it's a problem, but you're just kind of having a coaching discussion about it, then try to adopt kind of a relaxed posture. I don't mean real relaxed, but I mean, get out from behind your desk, sit side by side with the person, let your body language convey that this is not an intense disciplinary discussion. But on the other hand, if this is a problem that has recurred, it affects a lot of people, you view it as very serious, the company views it as very serious, you might want to be on one side of a desk and have the other person on the other side of the desk or table. No other papers on the desk. Sit in a firm and upright posture. All of this kind of stuff conveys the seriousness. So you have to decide what's the level of seriousness and how do you want to convey that. Who should be present? The general advice is only you and the person you're talking to. There are exceptions. First, if you are in a union environment, the union contract will specify who needs to be present. So whatever that contract says, you need to know it and follow it. Many union contracts specify that a union representative, or sometimes called a shop steward, needs to be present. In unusual circumstances, where it's a very serious issue and you're trying to convey the seriousness of the issue, it might make sense to have another manager there. But only in the most serious of circumstances. People will feel ganged up on if it's 2 against 1. How long should the meetings last? In general, less than 20 minutes. These are not counseling discussions. This is not therapy. Our plan is not to be here talking for 45 minutes to an hour. Short, well-planned meetings. How do you get started? Well, there's no magic words. I always hate it when somebody says, here are the words you should use. I never believe that. Don't believe it for a second. You have to use words that you are comfortable with, that sound like you. But these are some examples. Imagine I want to convey to somebody in the opening sentence or so that there's a problem and that they're obviously involved in this problem. So listen, Helen, I'm dealing with a situation that's troubling me. I'm going to need your help to get it resolved. Well, I haven't attacked anybody there, but I have made it clear that there is a problem and Helen's involved, and we're going to need to talk about this. Hey, Greg, there's something that's bothering me. I need to see if I can get your help to get it taken care of. So this kind of language is relatively neutral, but it gets to the point very quickly. Many people have asked me, should I start off by saying something positive? And I always say, if you're a good manager, you're the kind of person who's been saying positive things all along. You're the kind of person who's been recognizing good performance, as we talked about in last week's module on motivating people. And if you do that, and you just kind of routinely do that day in and day out with people, there's no need to start off by giving people 5 minutes of positive feedback. They've gotten positive feedback from you all along. You have the reputation as the kind of person who does that. You might remind somebody of that by saying something simple like, hey, Tony, a number of times over the past few months, I've shared some compliments that I've gotten about your work. And I'm always delighted to do that and really happy to know that you're doing a great job for people. But right now, I've got a couple of issues that are bothering me, and I'm going to need your help in getting them taken care of. So those are kind of simple ways of getting started. But whatever you do, don't spend too much time on the positive. People tend to bury the negative, and the employee can walk away feeling like, everything's great. He mentioned something, a little bit of a problem in the middle, but everything's great. So avoid that. Now we get back to your preparation. Once I've had my little opening statement, in whatever language works for you, now say, listen, here's kind of what we expect. The company expects that whenever somebody comes to one of our project planners with a request for an analysis and perhaps a critical path model, that we're going to respond to that, agree to do it, and we're going to try to get it done as quickly as possible. But what actually happened is I know somebody from Louise's group apparently approached you last week asking for a critical path model and gave you some data for it. And you basically said, listen, I don't know that this is really my job. If I can get some time for it, maybe I'll do it, but I'm really busy right now, and so I don't think you should expect it. And that's really not what I was expecting. So here's what we expected, here's what happened, and then just stop. So all you've done here is just describe, here's what I expect, here's what happened. And then stop. And all you need to just say is something after that, very simple, like, talk to me about it. Or what's going on, what happened? Hey, what should I know? Don't say to somebody, what do you have to say for yourself? That sounds aggressive. We don't want to be doing that. But hey, basically what you've done is you said, here's what I expect, or what the company expects. Here's what actually happened. Talk to me about it. What's going on? And let the person talk. And it's really important to do this at this point, is because we don't know for sure that we have the full story. And sometimes the employee will share something that we're unfamiliar with or unaware of. And that might really affect our decisions about how we move forward. So let the employee talk. Now, at this point, you're in a part of the conversation where you're not sure, you can't script it, you don't know how it's going to go. But your main goal is ultimately, however it goes, is to get back to the point of, here are the expectations, how are we going to get those met? What do we need to do that? If there's anything I can do to help, Tony, I'd be happy to do that. What do you need to do? So as this conversation progresses, your goal is to get the person to agree to meet expectations. And you don't want to use those words. You want to be able to say, here's what I need you to agree with. So, hey, Tony, look do I have your agreement now that we've talked about it, that if anybody comes to the project planning group and requests a critical path model, that first of all, we tell them, you're in the right place. We're the folks who can do that for you. We'll be happy to do that for you. 2, you'll get as much information as you can get. And 3, you'll give them the most realistic estimate of when you can get that done. And if it seems like that's too long, you'll come to me and you'll talk to me about getting some additional resources. So Tony, do I have your agreement that that's how you'll handle things from now on? So literally asking, don't just say it, literally ask the person, do you agree? Right? Do I have your commitment that that's how you'll handle things? So that's what you're trying to do. If the person is vague, yeah, I can probably do that. Then push a little more. What do you mean by that? Well, I'll try. I'm not sure what that means. I need you to get past trying. Here's what I need you to agree to. Can you agree to that? Do I have your agreement to do this? So that's what you're pushing for, and you don't want to leave the meeting without having that kind of agreement. Really important. All right. So I'm going to skip over a few things here. You can read some of these, but I want to make 2 points. One is that the focus of responsibility ultimately is with the employee. The employee has to step up to the plate and solve this problem. You might offer guidance, you might offer resources, you might offer help, but in the end, it's not your problem to solve. So that's really important. Also, sometimes employees will kind of agree with you right away and say, oh, you're definitely right about that, Jim, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's what we should be doing. But the problem is this. Or here's the problem is this. So they start telling you all kinds of things that are really kind of irrelevant, you know. And so this is a simple example, but it's a nice one. Somebody keeps coming in late. They've been late 4 times in the last 3 weeks. They're late 15, 20 minutes, not 2 minutes. You have a conversation with them. You mentioned that our expectation is that people have to be here at 8:30. We start customer contact at 8:30, and but you've been late this many minutes on each of these dates. And the person says, boy, you're absolutely right. I totally get it. And I really want to be here on time. And here's been the problem. The problem at home is that my kids tend to be staying up late because they want to stay up until their dad gets home from work, which I'm sure you can understand. And I think it's really important. I think we could both agree that it would be important for kids to see their dad in the evening. The problem is that because they're up so late now, it's really hard to get them out of the house in the morning. And so that's been a real struggle for me. And that's what's been making me late. But all of that really isn't relevant to you. It's not your job to solve that problem. It's not your job to make a suggestion about what they should do to address that problem. A much more reasonable response is to say something like, hey, that sounds frustrating to me. I get that. So what are you going to do to handle that? Because you got to be here at 8:30 every morning. I can't have you coming in at 8:35 or 8:40. What are you going to do to handle that? So you can be here at the time we need you here. You need to think about how to do that, and I need your commitment that you're going to get here at 8:30 every morning, and you're going to do whatever has to happen on your end to make that take place. So don't get into the business of suggesting solutions, because if you do that, the employee might say to you, "Oh, yeah, it's an interesting suggestion. I tried that a few weeks ago, but it didn't work." And now they're looking at you like, "You got any other great ideas?" That's not helpful. It's their problem, not your problem, to make those kinds of solutions. Another thing is that sometimes people will do what Dick Grody calls the irrelevancy game. And they'll say something like, listen, I understand that that's maybe your expectations, but I've worked in other project planning groups in other companies. That's not how they handled it there. Let me tell you how they handled it there. I think that was a much better way. That's going down. That's a really irrelevant conversation at this point. It's a way of trying to switch the responsibility from them to you, or from them to the company. Don't fall down that trap. Don't debate whether or not your way is the right way or the company's way is the right way. Instead, just say something simple like, listen, as far as how they handled it where you used to work, that might be an interesting conversation to have someday. But right now, I need you to agree that when somebody comes to the project planning group asking for a critical path model, you're going to do da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So don't go down that trap. Do not get caught in that discussion game. Finally, close up the discussion. If it's a disciplinary transaction of any kind, some companies have verbal warnings or verbal reminders. or written warnings or written reminders. If that's the case, you need to say it. You need to say it. If you said to somebody during the conversation, hey, listen, I'm warning you that it's really important that from now on you do X. That doesn't constitute a verbal warning or an oral warning. You got to say, hey, this conversation represents an oral warning or an oral reminder under the company's policy. You got to say it. You got to say it. There's some things you need to do after the meeting as well. You have to, and this is the biggest mistake I made. Please don't make this mistake like I did when I was 27 or 28. The first few conversations I had with this guy, which occurred over a period of a number of months, I didn't document. Because at the end of each conversation, I thought everything was going great. Things are going really well. That was a really good conversation. I think the problem's going to be solved. Don't, even if you think that's true, document the conversation. So write down the date. What did the person agree to do? Did you agree to do anything? What else did you talk about? Again, what were the expectations that you described? What had happened before? Write all that down. And so you have a way of documenting it. Now, the question is, what do you do with that documentation? Well, look, if you're really confident that this is going to be solved, it's never going to be an issue again, you know what? Write it down, all the information, send it to yourself in the form of an email. This creates an electronic record of the fact that you documented the conversation on the date that it happened. And maybe a year from now, nothing will have ever happened, and you can just go ahead and delete that email. But in case something does happen, you have the notes from that meeting. Another possibility is to send an email to the employee. And it can be phrased nicely. It doesn't have to be phrased in a hostile manner. Hey, Tony, thanks for taking 20 minutes out of your schedule today to talk to me. I appreciate it. As I mentioned, we have this expectation that whenever anybody comes to the project planning group for blah, 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 this is how we'll handle it. I heard from somebody last week, that's not what happened. Here's what happened. I'm really glad that we had a chance to talk about it. I'm especially glad that you agreed that going forward, when somebody does come to the group, you're going to say you're in the right spot. I can definitely help you. Let's talk about what some realistic turnaround times might be. And if you can't make a realistic turnaround time, you'll come and talk to me. So I can see if I can help out with any additional resources. So I'm really glad that you agreed to do that. I think this is really going to solve the problem. If you have any questions about it or any concerns about what I wrote here, please let me know. But again, thanks, and I appreciate your help in getting this problem solved. Now, that comes across as in a reasonably positive tone, but it also does clarify and confirm what was discussed. So that can be a nice approach as well. Obviously, if it's some kind of a warning or reminder that's a part of a formal disciplinary action, you have to follow whatever the company's policy is on that. Yeah. So I'm going to skip over some of these other things. You can read all these slides if you want. I'll just say one thing about written reminders or written warnings. Many people who are experts in this area say it's a bad idea to prepare a written warning in advance of the meeting. Just do what you always do. Here's what I expected. Here's what happened. Here's what's happened since the last time we talked. Here's what's happened since the oral warning or reminder that we had 2 months ago. And let me get ready to do that. I'm going to have this conversation. Again, I'm going to try to gain the person's commitment to make the changes. I'm going to thank them for doing that. I'm going to convey to them that our conversation will be followed up with an email, and that email will summarize our conversation and will constitute a written reminder or warning under the company's policies. And the email is just like the last one I described. It just describes, we talked on this date. I said here was the issue. Here's what actually happened. We had a good discussion. You agreed from now on you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and this won't happen again. I'm really delighted about that. I think that's great because this the third time we've had a conversation about this. This constitutes a written reminder or warning under the company's policy. Please let me know if you have any questions. And you don't even need to get the person to sign it these days. With all the electronics, once you send the person an email, there's a record that they've seen it and they've opened the file. and it's kind of demeaning to ask the person to sign it. So that's mainly what I wanted to say about that. And I'll just close this little conversation here by maybe mentioning something that you may have never heard of before, which is called a decision-making leave. This is an idea that comes from Dick Grody, and the idea is if somebody's already had a kind of a verbal warning or discussion, reminder, also a written one, maybe before firing them, sometimes what you do is you say to the person, listen, I want you to go home, and right now I want you to go home. Because we've had this, the problem continues to recur. We had some discussions, then happened again. So then we had a verbal reminder, then it happened again. We had a written reminder. It's happened since then. Listen, what I want you to do is go home just now, and I want you literally to take tomorrow off, and I'm going to pay you. And what I want you to think about is, are you willing to commit that there won't be any problems going forward? Or at this point, would you rather resign? Now, you can do either. If you feel that you can't commit that there won't be any problems in the future, it's fine to come back and resign. If you want to commit and you want to say, listen, I want to keep my job, I want to work here, there won't be any other problems going forward, not just this problem, but any other kind of problem. There won't be any more, I promise. Okay, that's great. Come back and tell me that. And if the employee says, no, I don't need to take the day off. I definitely want to keep my job. I promise you, I can commit right now. And Dick Grody recommends that you say, no. It's so important that you think about this and you understand the consequences that I want you to take the day off. So make sure you have plenty of time to reflect on it and make a very thoughtful, serious decision. And I don't want you to be worrying about money, so I'm going to pay you for it. So if today's Tuesday, I want you to take Wednesday off. And Thursday morning, we're going to talk, and you let me know what your decision is. What would you like to do? It's an interesting idea, and Grody describes some very nice instances of how that works. So altogether, these are some kind of basic concepts about how to have these difficult conversations. And it gives you a format and a structure for doing it, both for preparing for it and for executing the conversation and for what you're going to do after the conversation. So I want to pause now and see if there are any questions. So, okay, go ahead.
I guess, how important would you say, like, going into the discussion, what if there really is, like, a reason that the person is, like, I guess your reasoning that you think that the discussion is needed versus theirs, and theirs is actually right, and you turn out to be wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me say, that's why it's so important. Remember earlier on where you start off by saying, well, here's our expectations, and here's what I understand happened. Talk to me about it. What's going on? That part is so important, because at that point, it might be that the person says something to you where you go, oh, I didn't know that. That's really good. At which point, it's a very different conversation. And notice that up until that point, you haven't said anything threatening to the person, right? All you've said is, hey, Tony, I wanted to talk to you because, something's been bothering me and I need your help to get it resolved. So, our expectations are this, but my understanding is what happened last week is X, Y, and Z. And so that seems like there's a clear difference there between kind of what I was expecting and what I heard about. Talk to me. What's going on? And that gives them the chance to do that, and it gives you the chance to not wander down some path where you have automatically assumed the person is guilty before talking to them. So I'd say that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, huge. Yeah, it's really, that's why I included explicitly slides about that. I guess I should mention one other thing. This is something I did in an earlier part of my life, because I'm an old guy and I've done a lot of things. I mentioned I was a rehabilitation counselor when I was young, and because although my first master's degree was in education, my second was in industrial and organizational psychology. And at one point, I was running an employee assistance program for a company. And employee assistance programs are programs that are designed to provide confidential counseling and resources and referrals to employees who are having problems outside of work that are interfering with their ability to get their job done well. And sometimes somebody will say something like that. I mean, imagine you're in a conversation and somebody says, listen, I understand what's going on, and I understand your concerns, but I got to tell you, a few weeks ago, I came home from work and my wife announced, and I had no idea this was coming, that she wanted a divorce, and she moved out that night. And she took our kid, and we've been trying to negotiate times for us to share custody, and I don't want a divorce, and this is terrible, and I can't sleep, and I'm feeling depressed, and I got to tell you, a lot of times I'm just thinking to myself, I don't even know why it's worth getting up in the morning. Well, when you're hearing a conversation like that, that is a moment when you're not supposed to try to solve that problem. You're not a psychologist, but those are serious and legitimate problems, and it is really good at that point to say to the employee something like, Tony, as important as the issue is that I just discussed, your well-being is also really important to me. And it's important to us. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to get the contact information for our employee assistance program for you. And I'm going to, as strongly as I possibly can right now, encourage you to reach out to them, because they can provide resources and help. I will not know what you say to them. Nobody in the company will know what you say to them, but they can be of enormous help in these kinds of very difficult circumstances. And I feel for you as I listen to what you're saying, and I want you to be able to address this problem and make it work for you. And so that'll be a win for us, because you'll be feeling better, and our work problems will also be getting addressed, and it's a win for everybody. So I'm going to get back to you later today with that contact information, Tony, and I really strongly urge you to do that. I've seen, so as an aside here, speaking as Jim again, I've seen employee assistance programs do remarkable things for people. And as a boss, you're in an enormous position to help somebody. So when that happens, reach out to HR. Don't ever just do it on your own. Reach out to HR. Ask the best way to handle this, and get that referral information for them. Any other questions? Okay, well, I have one more poll for you. You're probably used to this. So let me get my my poll out here. Oops, here we go. Where the heck's my poll? Here we go. Okay. So here's the last poll. I'm going to launch this now. Okay. I think I'm going to launch it now. Here we go. All right. So again, as always, I want to find out what you think of today's session. Did you find this to be helpful? Again, notice where the strongly disagree and the agrees are on this, and give me a feel for whether or not this session was helpful. Again, I don't know what any one of you said here, but it does at least give me a feel for the opinions of people. So I'll let everybody finish voting. We're almost done with the votes, but let's get everybody to vote, and then we'll move on. Okay, so thanks to everybody for voting. I appreciate the very positive feedback on this session. I'm glad people thought it was helpful, and I really hope it will be. I wish I had this kind of a session when I was early in my career, believe me. And not only do I hope it will help you with this week's assignment, more importantly, I hope it will give you a framework, and you can hang on to this framework as something that you can refer to and look back on as your career advances and as you deal with difficult circumstances. As always, if you have any questions during the course of the week, please get in touch with me. Text me, call me, send me an email, whatever the case might be. And I hope you have a great evening. Enjoy the warm weather. And we'll have our next synchronous session next Monday. And that'll be on managing conflict, and negotiation, which is always a fascinating topic for me. And I hope it'll be a fun and interesting one for you as well. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.